Okay, so dodging and burning in photography is basically using darkening and lightening to show off certain areas in a photograph, to darken certain areas on a photograph. You can see in this photograph we have this kind of foreground element here, and a great way to take that out of the screen would be to burn that. So if we burn this, that's going to darken the image, and then if we dodge it, we're going to brighten it up. Dodging is increasing the exposure, burning is darkening the exposure. So burning, basically when you burn something, it darkens it, right? Take a lighter to a piece of paper, you're going to be darkening that paper. It's going to darken it from the flame. So just think of it in that way, and it's a lot easier to understand. And then dodging, I just like to think about it as like you're dodging the darkening, so you're brightening. That might be an easy way to think about it. But basically, it's again just to take certain elements in your image and brighten them or darken them, remove them from kind of your scene, to exploit a subject, to really make it pop out of your frame. Those are what dodging and burning is for. So first things first, we're not actually going to do anything inside of our Develop tab to this first image. First thing we're going to do is actually going to go into our Local tab and start dodging and burning. Now, I think what would be the best way to start out with local adjustments and dodging and burning is to use gradients. I think gradients are a great way to start and a great thing to master before you start brushing on things, simply because gradients, they kind of train your eye to look for naturalness. They train your eye to lower the opacity a little bit, and they're also a lot easier than brushing to make your photo look natural, to make an adjustment look natural. So I would recommend using your gradients before you actually go in and start modifying your brushes. Again, we're going to start out with a gradient. Now, my favorite thing to do with local adjustments is to create a vignette. What the first thing we're going to do with this local adjustment is we're actually going to click on the darkening thing. It's automatically set to darken for you, but I always just tend to pick a preset up here. Whenever you're working with local adjustments, to start out, I would recommend using a preset. Now, in your local adjustments, there's a ton of different presets. There's these first four, which are kind of your basic presets. You know, you have your lighten, which is going to lighten up things. It's going to dodge. And then you have your darkening, which is going to burn. So you have your dodging and burning are your first two options here. Now, that doesn't mean you're limited to dodging and burning simply with your exposure settings. You can modify in your local adjustments, you can modify your color. You can actually paint with color to replace with color. You can do a lot of things in these local adjustments. Now, we're going to start out first by creating a burning around our subject here. If we take a look at this photograph, it's pretty flat. There's not a whole lot of contrast, but I really like the minimalistic look of this shot, and I think we could exploit this subject a little more, make him pop out of the frame a bit by making that local adjustment vignette around our image. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down Shift and hit K on my keyboard. If you're new to masking or new to local adjustments, they aren't automatically applied for you like filters are. Filters are automatically applied for you. Now, we know this because in masking, white reveals and black conceals. So if we click on our mask view for this local adjustment and we view it, it's black, right? So we're not actually seeing any of this local adjustment onto the shot. Now, as we start modifying our gradients, we're going to see white areas start to pop up on this mask. That means that's revealing those adjustments onto our image. So what we're going to do is we're going to hold down Shift, hit K again. That's going to grab our adjustable gradient. Our adjustable gradient is a phenomenal tool for using shapes to modify certain adjustments on your shot. And the reason they're amazing is because they blend in so well. They're shapes, so they're they're straight lines. They're perfectly made circles, so they're really natural looking on your image rather than trying to brush on a circle or brush on a straight line. So with our adjustable gradient selected, I'm going to go up to my top tool modifier bar here. Now in my top tool modifier bar, this is where I modify all of the different tools. So I have all of these different things to modify my adjustable gradient here, which is, again, is just Shift and K. Now I'm going to go into my preset here. I'm just going to click Preset, and I'm going to go to Vignette. Now, if I look in here, I don't know if you can see in there very well, but if you're on Photo RAW and you're modifying a photo right now, just click on that preset option, and you can see the white is around the dark circle. Now that just means that the white area is going to be where that adjustment is applied to our image, and then the black circle is where it's being protected. So I'll just click on that. You can also do this with the shape here by clicking on either center or edges. So edges would be the opposite of a vignette. It would apply everything inside of the mask and protect all of your edges around it. But we're going to leave it at center there. So I'm just going to drop it down kind of right in the middle there. And now we can see that we've burned this area around our sailboat here. We've darkened it up, and in essence, we've burned this area. And by doing that, if I move my mouse away, I mean, it's a janky vignette. It's not blended in very naturally, but at first they aren't really blended, and you kind of got to go in and modify them. But if I turn this off and on, it does a whole lot to take away some of this distracting foreground, which we need this foreground to make this shot, but we don't need it as bright as it is. So it takes away a little bit of that foreground. Now, what I typically do whenever I'm making a vignette with my local adjustment is I drag it in, and you've probably seen this a million times if you've seen my tutorials, but I drag it in all the way. All you have to do to drag it in and make it smaller is to drag the solid line here. This solid line is going to modify the size of the actual area that you're protecting. Now, these little handles to the top and bottom and then the right and the left, those are going to modify the width and the height of your shape here. So if I pull this up, you can see it's making the shape less oval and more like a circle. I'm going to leave it more like an oval. That's more vignetting because we're looking at a landscape image. But what I typically do is I'll grab this solid line, drag it pretty much all the way in. I do this with portraits too. I think it looks a lot more natural this way. But I just drag it all the way in. Now, if I go over here to my adjustments, we can see that it's just kind of a little speck, right? It's not like doing anything to our shot. It's just like a little speck, like we put on a brush to that little area. But what we can do is we're going to hover back over, and I'm going to grab those perforated edges, and I'm just going to drag those out. Oops. Drag those out basically as far as I want. And the reason I like to do this is because it feathers the vignette so much that it makes it look a lot more natural. Now if I head over to my adjustment and I turn this off and on, now it's a lot more natural of a vignette because we're focusing in and we're feathering all of those areas that's creating our mask in here. So if we go over and I view my mask, before it was black, right? Now if we look at it, this entire thing is white, and on the inside is black. So that's concealing the adjustment from the photograph, this black area. But we can see that with our feathering here, and I think I could feather it, or I could modify it on here. So if I pull out our straight lines, let's just modify the feathering. So if I pull, So if I pull in on the feathering, like that, and then I'll make this even bigger, and then I'll pull in on the feathering even more. You can see it just keeps making that blended area, if you want to call it that, the blended area in between the adjustment and the area that's protected, it blends it in a lot more naturally if you have your feathering a lot higher. Now you can always leave it like this. It's totally personal preference, but to start, I would make them so feathered because they look a lot. Anytime you're applying a vignette, you really want them a little bit more subtle anyway, unless you're going for a really kind of harsh black and white look and it's really vignetted, but you usually want your vignettes pretty subtle, right? You don't really want them like intense on your shot, like covering up every little detail. But you can see that if I pull up on this and I just keep feathering it and feathering it, it just makes that area nice and soft like a pillow. It's like a cloud now. It's just taking the eye right directly into there, but not in a harsh way. It's just nice and blended, and then bringing our eyes right into the subject there. Now, what we'll do in a sec is we'll flip this to make the subject pop, but I'm just gonna make this a little bit smaller, and I guess I could view my shot now. So I'll make this a little bit smaller, like that. Put it over him right there. Perfect. So I think that looks pretty good like that. Bada bing, bada boom. Now what you can do, now that you've created this, is if you want to modify things in this adjustment, you can go back with a preset, or you can create a preset with those adjustments, and then you can go back and apply it to photos later. So one thing I like to do with these preset, or with these local adjustments, is I usually head up real quick and I'll go into my blending options here with that gear icon, and I typically modify my shadows and my skin here. Now, I like to do that because it pulls a lot of this darkening away from them, and it almost applies it just to the highlights, so it acts less like a strong vignette and more like a blend moded vignette, if that makes sense. So if I go to these 3 sliders here, these highlights, shadows, and skin sliders, these are going to protect those certain tones from my shot. So if I pull up on the shadows, you can see it's protecting those shadow tones from my image, but it's still applying it to the midtones. So if I turn this off and on, it's still applying that to the midtones. So I can pull that back a little bit, maybe about 40, and then I could pull up on my skin tones a little bit. And that's gonna let those greens and that foliage in the foreground, that's gonna make those pop a little bit because I'm protecting them with that slider there. So I can modify, just modify it to taste here. But I do like the vignette to be quite subtle. And what you can do to make it even more subtle is you can just modify all of your settings down here, make it super strong, or not that strong, that's super contrasted. And then maybe pull back on your blacks a little bit. That's going to incorporate some true black in there, right there. And now with pretty much every adjustment I make, or majority of the filters I make, if I'm not sure how I want it to look on there, but I know I want it on there, is I'll drag my opacity all the way to 0. Make sure you don't have I'm just going to hit Z on my keyboard so we don't look at that, the masking outline. And then drag your opacity incrementally, just back up to wherever you want it. So I think that looks pretty perfect right about there. Just like that. So now, say I love this look. I actually do like that. I think this would look good on a lot of photographs. I can go in here and I'll click this blending mode that'll hide the blending options. I'll go to my more right there, and then I'll go down to Save New Style. Now when I click Save New Style, I can just do Fave Vignette, or if you want to put in like Fave Burning of Edges or something like that. But yeah, now we can always go back, and if I undo this, I can click Add Adjustment. Now keep in mind that it's not always going to be applied with the mask on it. So you go to apply, applies it with the mask and everything. So look at that, bada bing. It's perfect. So now if we hit our / key on our keyboard, we've just darkened those areas up a bit, and now we have kind of this sailboat as our subject. Now, again, just kind of improving on our gradient use, let's copy this mask. So I'm going to go into my masking options for this adjustment. I'm going to copy this mask, just click Copy. And then I'm going to add another adjustment. I'm going to double click this adjustment, and I'll name it Lightning. Not Lightning, well I guess it is Lightening. And then I'm going to click on Lighten. And then I'm going to go into my masking options, and I'm going to paste the mask that we had earlier. Now that's going to basically create the opposite of what we need. But in masking, white reveals and black conceals. So if we view our mask here, we can see it's revealing all of our adjustment on the corners outside of the inside of our mask. So we can click this invert button. So if we hit invert, now it's only applied on the inside, but we still have that really nice blending going on from the feathering of that adjustable gradient. So if I click view and I view my photo here, now I can modify the lightening area, I'll just say the brightening area, the dodging. I should use dodging and burning. So I should use I'll use the dodging area here. We'll just rename this dodging rather. Oops. Dodging, and then I could rename this burning. And then you just double click to rename the adjustments. And you can do that with filters or anything. Just double click the little title of it and you can rename it. So now we have our dodging here. And I can, again, pull back on the opacity, incrementally pull it up until I like that look, right? And then I can always go in here. I can hold down Shift, hit K on my keyboard, And then I can modify that same mask, but now it's applying the dodging or the brightening to this sailboat. But I want it to be a little more of coverage. I want there a little bit more, to be a bit more coverage around kind of the trees here and then the water. So we're just going to increase the size of this like that. But we're not going to modify the feathering because the feathering is perfect, I think. It's really, really intense feathering, which I like. But we're just increasing the size so it just takes up more area. And you can also just do that to taste. So you can see as I brighten this up, it brightens everything up. So maybe just like that. Looks pretty good. And then I'm going to head down here and I'm just going to increase the structure, because again, we can always modify everything. Besides the brightening of things or the dodging, we can modify different sliders in here. So I'm just going to pull up on the structure, and then I'll just increase the detail and make that little area pop. Now you could also modify the color too. So you'll notice this area has some nice greens in here and some little colors that we could make pop. So we can go back down to that burning, and I could increase the saturation, and that'll make that vignette a little bit more colorful, and then I'll make those colors pop in here. And then you could also match that up here by saturating that up a little bit also. Or you could just go back into develop and then just pull up on your saturation slider. But if you're like me and you like to modify each little adjustment kind of on its own, that's probably the way to do that. And so now that we have those masks for our dodging and burning, if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, I mean, I think that looks a lot better than this, and it really makes my eye jump right to the sailboat rather than, you know, perusing everywhere else, because it is a very minimalistic shot. And you know, if you're taking shots like this is a great way to really just hone in on your subject. But so now that we have that, we can go over to our effects, and we already have that mask copied. So we could go in here and add a filter. We could add maybe a curves filter or something. Make a little bit of a fade like that. Pull up on that. Pull down on our shadows a bit. And then I'll just maybe pull up on the midtones. So this is basically only applied to that area anyway, but if we're going to brighten this up quite a bit like that, maybe like that. So let's say that brightens up this sailboat too much. So we can just use our mask before, paste that in there, boom, and then it removes it immediately from the sailboat, and then we still have that really nice kind of cinematic adjustment with our curves filter. So copying and pasting masks saves you so much time. It keeps things very consistent. It just makes sure you know, your adjustments fit with each other. So copying and pasting masks, I would definitely recommend it, especially with local adjustments. You can also copy and paste these masks back into layers. So if you wanted to modify, you know, a layer mask with an already copied local adjustment mask, you could do that. So yeah, so we've created that photo with just literally using, you know, 2 local adjustments and a curves filter. I have a bunch of blue jays fighting around each other, so hopefully that's not really distracting, guys. But yeah, not a too hard of an edit, and a really great way to just pop your subject out. So let's say now we don't want to vignette something, we just want to make something pop. We could do the same exact thing, but we're actually going to use AI Auto to help us out. Typically, if you're just rushing through a shot and it seems like it's a nice shot and everything's exposed, I wouldn't worry too much about your tone and color. Usually AI Auto does a pretty good job of boosting things up and making things a little bit more exposed and lively. Just like this. I think that does a pretty good job. It looks nice. If we look at our histogram, you know, we're not really peaked over here with our darks. We're kind of peaked on our shadows and our midtones, which is nice. We have a nicely exposed photograph here. And we could always pull back on our auto. I might pull it back to about 85. That looks pretty good. So now to make something pop out, it's similar, but you also want to consider what you're making pop. Now, if I were to brush this on, I would have to go in and kind of brush every little area. And to make it look natural, it'd be a lot more difficult than just putting on an adjustable gradient. So all I'm going to do over here is I'm just going to choose my more, and I'm going to choose Magic Eye Fixer. Now with Magic Eye Fixer, I'm actually going to lower the structure there, like that, and then I'm going to take the noise down. And the reason I want to take the noise down is because I want to soften things up a bit, and by removing a little bit of that noise, it's going to kind of take in a softer look, which is what I like. We're actually going to add on a sun flare after this, but for right now, we're basically going to dodge this hand area with an adjustable gradient. So now that we have our exposure set, we have our haze, we have our noise, what we can do is we can hold down Shift, hit K again, but we're actually going to go in here and we're going to choose shape and we're going to choose edges. Now before we were using the center, so we're going to choose edges now. We'll drop this down, and now we can see that it brightens up everywhere on the inside of our mask. So I can use these solid lines again, just like that. Bada bing. And then I'm going to feather it a little bit less than I did, but I still want to feather it quite a bit. I don't want it feathered like that because then it's going to almost brighten everything up. And I think we're pretty good on exposure over here in our corners and such. So I'm just going to brighten it up maybe, or feather it maybe about right there. Now, again with this dodge, so we're going to put dodging of hand. With this dodging here, when we're brightening things up like this, we definitely want to pay attention to our overall mood of the scene. This looks like the hand is really popping out, and it's almost a little bit overexposed. So to help us out, we're just going to go and we're going to grab our opacity slider again, drag it back to 0, and then just incrementally pull it back up. Probably about right. Well, I'm going to pull it up a little stronger. I'm going to pull it up to about maybe 75 or 70. Now, if I turn this off and on, does a really great job of boosting up the exposure of the hand. It looks nice like that. If we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, I really like how this edit is coming along. Now, one thing I don't want is kind of the haloing around the adjustment we're making. So we can see that we're boosting up this area around here, and we can combat that a little bit and also combat a little bit of the brightness in this hand by going into, again, our blending options and using these different sliders to protect those tones. So typically whenever I'm modifying a dodging like this, where I'm dodging a specific area on my photograph, I really fine-tune these sliders because they can help you out and make everything look natural. So just by playing with them, you'll notice maybe these are more kind of shadowy midtones. So if I pull up on my shadows here, you can see it's darkening those shadow tones back there. It's darkened those tones. So if I pull this back, see how it brightens those? And then if I pull it up, it darkens those tones up, and it removes a little bit of that glow that we're having around this adjustment, right? It looks a little bit more natural like that. Now, we can even do that to our skin here, and that'll just definitely help out these kind of blown out areas in our skin and make it look, again, just a little bit more natural. Now, I'm not going to modify the highlights because I like how the highlights look, but it's all up to you, personal preference. And then I can turn this off and on. And it's just a very gentle adjustment, nothing crazy, but it really makes a huge difference. If I turn that off, the hand is considerably dark, but we're still using our develop. If we were to modify any of these develop settings, we'd be brightening up the majority of the tones in the shot. But by using this local adjustment to dodge the hand, we're just brightening up those specific areas. So it's just a really helpful way to just make little things pop like that. And then again, you can copy and paste those masks. So if I click in here and I copy this mask, we'll go into effects, I'll add a filter, I'll add a sun flare. How does that one? We'll use this one maybe. That looks pretty. Is that the one I was using? Oh no, okay. So increase the size of that maybe a bit. So I'm just going to increase the size with this scale option, right? Like that. Now I want the light coming over here because that's where it looks like the light is hitting anyway, on the top of her hand. So I'm going to flip this to the other side so it's on that right corner, right? Now we've copied that mask. If we had a sun flare here, it wouldn't be basically covering her hand. It would be coming from her shoulder. And ideally, you'd want a little bit of more shadows here on her hand. So to protect that area, we're just going to paste that mask in like we did before. Just click paste. But remember, we're pasting that white on the mid or on the inside we're protecting everywhere on the outside, but we want it opposite. So let's invert again. But we can see that our feathering now is a little bit too intense. So just M on my keyboard. M, that'll grab me my masking bug. So now I'm just gonna lower the feathering, right? Now with this, you kind of want it to overlap a little bit on the hand. So make it feathered quite a bit, not a crazy amount, and then lower the protecting area, because you want a little bit of this glow on her hand. It'll look like your fingertips are glowing a bit, which is a look that you kind of want when you have a sun filter or a sun flare filter. So we'll just make that a little bit less feathered again, kind of like that. Make sure there's not any rough halos. Boom, that looks pretty good. So we're just protecting this ring area, which is exactly what we want. And now we're gonna head over to our sun flare, and we're gonna use those 3 sliders again. We're gonna click on our blending options, and we're gonna go and let's just pull up on our shadows a little bit, or not our shadows, our skin tones a little bit. And that'll just remove some of the sun flare from the skin tones, those middle tone, the middle gray tones within the photograph. So we'll just pull it back, pull it up to right there. And so now if I turn off this sun flare, see how it's not covering her hand up? It looks a lot more natural because we've removed that from the hand right there. And we can always pull back again, pull back on the opacity, and then incrementally pull that up. And then if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, in just a few minutes, you know, a quick little edit, we got a nice sun flare coming through, the wedding ring's protected and popping out. So really easy way to do some dodging and burning with your, again, kind of a vignette local adjustment. So this is your classic example of when you want to use dodging and burning, right? You have a really bright sky and a dark foreground, and you want everything to look even. Well, you didn't shoot in HDR, so you only have one image to work with. No problem at all. I used to shoot HDR because I shot real estate, and I'd shoot like 7 image brackets, and I just got annoyed dealing with that many images. So I just shoot RAW now. One shot, you can basically get the same look. So what we're gonna do here is we're gonna go into our develop, and we're gonna use our AI match to help us out a little bit. Now, if we shot this photograph, we'd probably wanna use a little bit of tone and color to modify it before we started using local adjustments. Now, we could use just local adjustments, but AI Auto is such a fast way to edit things, so I'll just go bada bing, bada boom, hit AI Auto. And it does actually a really good job with this shot. It doesn't darken the sky at all, and it does brighten up this foreground quite a bit. But the sky is still too bright, and we don't really see a lot of our foreground elements. There's actually a road in here. So to reveal the road, we're gonna use local adjustments, but we first need to darken our sky. So we'll go into our local tab. Now, we'll name this one Burning, and we'll just put Burning Sky, because we're gonna burn our sky area, not literally. And I'm gonna click Darken to make sure it's darkening. Now, again, I'm just gonna hold down Shift and hit K. That's gonna grab me my adjustable gradient, which is perfect for dodging and burning. You're gonna be using shapes and gradient masks. Now I'm gonna go to my preset here, and we're gonna choose linear bottom. Now the reason we want linear bottom is because if you're using Photo RAW right now, you can see that linear bottom has black on the bottom and white on top. That means it's applying that adjustment onto the top of our photograph and protecting everywhere beneath it. So I'll hit linear bottom, and then I'll just drop this down. And then I'm just gonna pull this down, and what I wanna do is I wanna match the look of things. I wanna match the look of this image, maybe about right there, just like that. And then if I turn this off and on, you can see how much detail it pulls back into the shot from the sky, right? And it doesn't really take a whole lot away from these areas. So again, we're gonna use our blending options here. These are really powerful. And then we're just gonna pull up, and we don't want the shadows really any darker, right? We want them usually kind of how they are. So we're gonna pull up on our shadows there, and that's gonna protect the shadowy tones in these rocks. So if I turn this off and on now, it still does the same adjusting, but if I double click the shadows, look at the image as I double click the shadows. you can see it really adds in a lot more darkening to those shadows in there, which we don't want. We want to leave those kind of as they are. So I'll just pull up on the shadows there. That'll protect those shadowy tones. Looks great just like that. And then we'll go in here, and I'm actually going to go, and I kind of want to just pull up on my midtones just a hair, and I mean a hair, maybe about 5, not 6, maybe max 7. Because as soon as I start getting crazy with the midtones, I'm going to be losing all of the detail that I've brought back with this adjustment. So I don't want to get crazy with that just yet. Now that we have our burning done, we can dodge our foreground area, and we can brighten up and see all of these elements and see the little road in here. So I'm going to add an adjustment. I'll double click this. Oops, we don't want that going there. Double click the title, rename it Dodge Foreground. So we're dodging the foreground, we're brightening it up, right? And I'm going to go to reveal shadows here. Now we'll see how this works. This usually works pretty well when you have kind of a shadowy foreground. And we're going to do the same thing we did, but we're going to switch our preset here to linear top. Now I know that's confusing. I don't know why it's like that. But linear top applies your adjustment to the bottom, and linear bottom applies it to the top. It's basically what's being protected. It's not telling you where it's being applied. It's telling you what's being protected. Okay, so we're on linear top. We're going to drop this down, and bada bing. Look at that. It already brightens things up. It looks so much better like that. And then we can just kind of feather that. And you don't want to pull it too much towards the sky, though, because we're going to be losing a lot of that detail that we brought back with our burning adjustment. Now, this may be too bright also. So what I like to do before I start modifying things is I'll just pull back on the opacity and then incrementally pull it up. And I think we could probably leave it at 65 or so. That looks pretty good just like that. Now, what we want to do here is we're going to pull this, this feathering up maybe just a hair more. So a little bit of that brightening kind of rests on this mountain. We're not too worried about the darkening over here, because if we had sun blazing in from the left side of our screen, it would be hitting, you know, that waterfall right there, but it wouldn't actually be hitting the left side of that mountain where it's shadowed. So we're not really worried about brightening that area. We just want our foreground. We want to see our road. We want everything kind of consistent. And this actually looks pretty good. We could actually go in here, and one thing we could do is maybe add in a bit of structure. Now that's just going to make things pop a little bit. And that's going to apply detail into that bottom adjustment there. Now keep in mind that when you apply structure, it's going to add in some contrast. It may darken things up. If it does darken things up, you can always boost things with maybe a mid-tone adjustment like that. And that'll combat a little bit of that contrast that you're applying with your structure slider. But I mean, this may be a little bit too intense for some people as well. It's a little bit too intense for me, but just to give you guys an idea, so we've done AI auto, right? And then we've done a dodging and a burning. And if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, we started with this, and now we have this. And I think it even does need a little bit more of an adjustment. One thing you could do in here is use your actual develop tab. Ooh, and we're pulled back on the, so the highlights are pulled back quite a bit, and that makes things look flat. Now what we can do is just pull back on our whites. Oops, we don't want to pull them up too much because it's going to, again, lose some of that detail we brought back in that brightening. But by adding in that 11 or so of those whites, it makes a huge difference. So if I click these to turn them off, see how that flattens that sky up? That's what we don't want. We don't want that really flat sky. So we're going to pull up on our whites here. And again, it doesn't have to be too crazy, to about 11 or so. And we still have a lot of that detail back, but now it looks a lot more consistent with the energy of the rest of the photograph, right? So now if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, we still have a lot of that detail bringing back, but it's not as flat because we pulled up on some of those whites. And you could always go in here and add another local adjustment. You could add an adjustment and do the same thing we did earlier with the vignetting, which I like to do on these little areas. So I'll just Shift K, edges, drop this down. That's going to be a darkening one, but you could just quickly go in there, modify it, make it a little bit elongated, and just place it over the top of this. And then we'll use the magic eye fixer again. Whoa. Right? And that's really intense, right? So we'll just feather that a ton, right? And then lower the opacity a ton. And then just by, you know, incrementally again, pulling up, I keep saying incrementally, but it's just the best way to do it. Because if you go like that, boom, you're at craziness. But if you go down to 0, and then you just are like, okay, we're at 18's kind of nice, that's not bad. And then if I go to 50, that's too much. So what's 25? That's a little too much. There's 20. 20 looks pretty good, I think. And we can always go in and modify our protecting sliders, so we can go pull up on our highlights. That'll protect any of that brightening from our highlights and make sure they're not any brighter than we want them. And then we can pull up on our skin tones a little bit, and that'll remove some of that from the sky, and then also these areas that we have that are brighter. And then if we turn this adjustment off and on, it's subtle, but it's a nice little boost right there. And then if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, there you go. Just a really, really easy way to, you know, brighten up your foreground or dodge the area on your foreground, and to burn your sky a little bit to bring back some of the detail that was there.